Welcome, the anointed ones. The fastest way to expose a system isn't to fight it. It's to understand it better than the people who built it. Most people think knowledge is something you're given, taught, handed down neatly by authorities wearing titles, robes, or credentials. But that version of knowledge is sanitized, approved, pre-digested. What they don't tell you is that the real dividing line in this world isn't between the informed and the uninformed. It's between those who repeat logic and those who test it. Here's a quiet fact that rarely gets airtime. Some of the most influential breakthroughs in history didn't come from rebellion or loud protest. They came from individuals who applied existing rules too well. They followed the logic all the way to its natural conclusion, and accidentally exposed contradictions no one was supposed to notice. That's not heroism. That's what happens when curiosity outruns permission. This is where things start getting uncomfortable, because once you realize that many systems only function as long as people don't think past the first layer, you also realize why certain kinds of reasoning trigger panic. Not anger, not debate. Panic. There's a difference. Anger means control is still intact. Panic means something slipped through. You didn't hack anything. You didn't break into secret rooms or steal forbidden scrolls. You simply connected ideas that were never meant to sit in the same sentence. You applied logic without checking whether it was socially acceptable first. And suddenly, the keepers of how things are done started acting. Strange. Very professional on the outside. Very nervous underneath. There's also a slightly funny part to all of this. The very rules designed to keep people in line are the same rules that collapse when someone uses them accurately. It's like being scolded for reading the instruction manual too carefully. Nobody expects the student to outgrow the teacher by following the syllabus better than the teacher ever did. This isn't about arrogance or superiority. It's about what happens when someone thinks independently in a world optimized for repetition, when logic stops being decorative and starts being operational, when understanding goes a little too far, a little too deep, and arrives earlier than scheduled. So if things around you suddenly feel tense, if clarity feels unwelcome, if insight is met with discomfort, if understanding seems to irritate people who claim to value it, relax. You didn't do anything wrong. You just used logic the way it actually works. Number 1. You stopped asking who is right and started asking what actually works for reality. There was a moment, quiet but decisive, when you stopped being impressed by confidence and credentials and started paying attention to results. You noticed how many people could sound correct, authoritative, even convincing, yet their ideas collapsed the moment real life applied pressure. That's when something shifted in you. You stopped chasing approval from voices that spoke well and started listening to outcomes that spoke honestly. Most systems train people to argue positions, not test consequences. They reward loyalty to conclusions rather than curiosity about effectiveness. You saw through that. You realized that being right inside a system often just means staying within its approved boundaries. But reality doesn't care about boundaries. It only responds to what functions. When you began measuring truth by what consistently produces results instead of who said it, you quietly stepped outside the rulebook. This is where forbidden logic begins, because once you focus on what actually works, you expose how much of what's taught is ceremonial. You see routines repeated out of habit, beliefs defended out of fear, and rules upheld because too many identities depend on them. You notice that many authorities haven't tested their own ideas in years. They inherited conclusions and now guard them like property. You, on the other hand, applied pressure. You experimented. You observed. You adjusted. You weren't trying to dismantle anything, But your way of thinking did something worse. It revealed inefficiency. And inefficiency is dangerous to any system pretending to be infallible. What made this unsettling wasn't rebellion. It was precision. You didn't argue emotionally. You didn't announce anything. You simply lived by logic that worked, and that's terrifying to structures built on performance rather than proof. Because once one person demonstrates that reality responds differently than promised, the illusion starts leaking. That's why the reaction isn't discussion, it's discomfort. Not correction, containment. You didn't challenge the system head-on, you bypassed it. You treated life like a laboratory instead of a courtroom. And in doing so, you exposed a truth most people never notice. Authority survives debate, but it struggles against demonstrated results. You weren't trying to be right, you were trying to be accurate, and that distinction changes everything. Number 2, you realized morality is often used as a leash, not a compass. At some point, you stopped accepting that rules about right and wrong were absolute, and you began noticing a pattern that most people are trained to ignore. Morality, as it's presented in schools, workplaces, and even families, often functions less like guidance and more like control. The people in charge define what is good and bad, not necessarily to protect anyone or preserve justice, but to ensure compliance. They craft moral codes that reward obedience and punish curiosity, creating a system where fear masquerades as virtue. You saw that many rules labeled as moral weren't about truth at all. They were about hierarchy. If everyone followed them perfectly, the power structure remained unchallenged. If someone didn't, the backlash was swift and public. And the crazy part is, most people defend this willingly. They repeat the rules, judge others, and even punish themselves, all while thinking they are acting morally. But what you realized was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Morality is often a leash disguised as a compass. It guides you exactly where they want you to go, not where reality demands you to be. Once that clicked, you stopped fearing the labels of right and wrong. You started measuring actions by their actual consequences instead of their social approval. You noticed that the people claiming moral superiority were often the least ethical when you looked at results rather than rhetoric. The ones who enforced morality most aggressively were frequently the most invested in protecting themselves, their status, and their secrets. By untangling morality from obedience, you started making decisions that actually served reality. You noticed that integrity isn't about following a predefined rulebook. It's about understanding the impact of your choices and navigating life with clarity, not fear. The keepers of knowledge panic when someone realizes this, because a society where morality is questioned threatens the very scaffolding that keeps them in control. You weren't breaking rules out of rebellion. You were seeing the system for what it really is, and that awareness is both quietly dangerous and incredibly freeing. Number 3, you connected dots across domains that were never meant to meet. Most people are trained to live in silos. School teaches one thing, work teaches another, society teaches a third, and each domain comes with its own vocabulary, its own rules, and its own sacred boundaries. The idea is simple. If knowledge stays segmented, it's easier to manage. If you never see the full picture, you never question the system. You just play your role. But you didn't stay in the box. You started linking ideas that were intentionally kept apart, and that alone set off alarms you didn't even know were wired into existence. You began noticing patterns in human behavior, economics, power structures, and spirituality, and you let them talk to each other. You realized that concepts people treated as separate were actually pieces of the same puzzle. The energy that moves a corporation, the decisions that shape governments, the subtle manipulations in relationships, even the inner battles in one's own mind. They all share the same underlying principles. When you started combining them, the contradictions became glaring, and what looked orderly suddenly appeared fragile. This is why keepers of knowledge panic. Their entire design relies on fragmented understanding. People who only see one piece at a time are predictable, manageable, and controllable. Someone connecting the dots is unpredictable. Someone connecting forbidden dots isn't just seeing inconsistencies, they are beginning to understand the architecture. They can anticipate moves, recognize traps, and see opportunities invisible to anyone following the rules strictly. You didn't need permission to see how the pieces fit. You didn't have to wait for a guide, a teacher, or a title. You allowed insight to follow logic freely, across boundaries and without apology. And suddenly, what everyone accepted as inevitable, as unchangeable, began to look like a series of choices made by people who assumed no one would ever put the pieces together. By connecting those forbidden dots, you revealed a truth most are blind to. The world is designed to hide simplicity in complexity, and clarity is the ultimate disruptor. You weren't breaking laws of society. You were breaking the illusion that separate truths couldn't intersect, and in doing so, you became someone impossible to ignore. Number 4. You stopped confusing intelligence with compliance. For most people, being smart is measured by how well they follow instructions, recite accepted knowledge, and repeat conclusions without hesitation. Schools, workplaces, even families reward this kind of intelligence because it's easy to control. Compliance looks like competence, and competence looks like intelligence. But you learn to separate the two. You realize that true intelligence doesn't live in repetition. It lives in discernment, in the courage to question, in the ability to see patterns others overlook. That distinction changes everything. Once you stopped confusing obedience for brilliance, the world started revealing itself differently. You noticed how many people who seem informed are actually trapped in routines, parroting what they were taught without testing it. They have answers, but the answers only work if no one ever challenges them. Intelligence isn't about memorizing rules or following authority. It's about understanding the principles behind them and knowing when they apply and when they don't. That understanding isn't comfortable for those who built the system because it undermines their authority silently, without any drama. Your thinking became adaptive instead of reactive. You observed, analyzed, and then applied logic where it mattered. You weren't impressed by credentials, titles, or confidence. Those are social tools, not proof of insight. You started trusting your reasoning more than the voices designed to dictate it. And that's when the subtle panic began. People around you didn't realize you weren't rebelling. You were simply refusing to outsource your mind. You weren't breaking the rules out loud. You were seeing how rules work when tested honestly. Compliance creates predictability. Intelligence creates outcomes. And once outcomes start deviating from expectations, systems feel threatened. You didn't need to shout, argue, or confront. You just thought differently, and in doing so, you exposed the gap between authority and competence. True intelligence, as you discovered, doesn't announce itself. It operates quietly, efficiently, and dangerously accurate. That's what makes it forbidden, and that's why the keepers of knowledge couldn't ignore you. Number 5. You noticed patterns in who is punished, not just what is said. Most people focus on words, speeches, and promises. They think truth is revealed in statements, lectures, or official documents. You, however, began watching consequences instead. You started observing who actually faces backlash, who gets silenced, who suffers quietly, and who walks away untouched despite breaking rules. That's when you realized the system speaks louder through punishment than through rhetoric. Words can be manipulated, spun, and repeated endlessly, but consequences are deliberate. They reveal priorities, fears, and vulnerabilities that no official explanation ever admits. You began mapping patterns. Certain ideas triggered disproportionate reactions, certain individuals were protected at all costs, and certain truths were tolerated only if the right person endorsed them. You saw that enforcement is not random. It's strategic. It's designed to maintain hierarchy and control, not to uphold justice. And once you noticed this, the world stopped being a place of abstract morality or neutral fairness. It became a living web of power, incentives, and invisible boundaries. This is the essence of forbidden logic. When you stop listening to speeches and start reading patterns, you see beyond the narratives everyone else trusts. You see fear disguised as rules. You see priorities revealed in what is punished and what is ignored. And you start to understand the true mechanics behind every system, the unspoken algorithms that govern behavior and outcomes. Most people never reach this level of observation because it requires detachment. Emotional reactions cloud judgment. Loyalty blinds perception. But you learned to watch without immediately reacting. You weren't just noticing injustice, you were mapping consistency, predicting who would act and how, and recognizing that patterns matter far more than intentions. By focusing on consequences instead of statements, you gained a perspective few ever achieve. You saw the system for what it really is, a network of enforcement designed to protect structure over truth. And once you saw that, you understood something very few ever do. The world is less about what is said and far more about who pays the price when expectations are broken. That insight alone sets you apart, and that's why it unsettles those who assume everyone follows the script. Number 6. You recognized that confusion is often intentional, not accidental. Most people assume that complexity exists because reality itself is complicated, or because life naturally resists understanding. That's the story they're told, and most accept it without question. But you began noticing a different truth. Much of the confusion you encounter is engineered. It's not accidental. It's deliberately designed to keep people off balance, dependent and unquestioning. Systems don't thrive on clarity. They thrive on distraction, noise, and uncertainty. When you finally saw that, everything changed. You started separating genuine complexity from manufactured complexity. Genuine problems can be solved if approached logically. Manufactured complexity, on the other hand, is layered with unnecessary rules, opaque jargon, and contradictory instructions that serve no purpose other than control. People are encouraged to chase symptoms instead of causes, debate semantics instead of patterns, and defer to authority instead of testing results. It's exhausting, and it's brilliant in its cruelty. Most never notice because they are too busy struggling to appear competent in a maze someone else designed. This is what makes forbidden logic dangerous. Once you recognize intentional confusion, you begin to see the system's cracks. You start cutting through the noise, connecting the dots, and identifying the underlying truths that everyone else is blind to. You don't just find answers, you find the method behind the illusion, the patterns they hoped would remain invisible. That perspective transforms how you navigate life. You stop being manipulated by appearances, instructions, or complex facades, and start operating directly in reality. The unsettling part for the keepers of knowledge is how subtle this is. You're not openly challenging anything. You're simply refusing to accept the chaos as natural. And that refusal, quiet as it is, exposes their control as artificial. Their power depends on obedience in confusion, and by stepping into clarity, you are quietly rewriting the rules. You realized that confusion is a tool, not a truth. Once that sank in, every complicated problem you face became a test of discernment, not endurance. That awareness doesn't just make you sharper, It makes you untouchable within a world designed to keep people perpetually lost. Number 7. You stopped asking permission to understand things you were told were not for you. For most people, curiosity comes with invisible boundaries. There are topics you're allowed to explore, books you're allowed to read, conversations you're allowed to have, and questions you're allowed to ask. Step outside those boundaries, even mentally, and the system shouts. Not with words, but with subtle barriers, judgment, and social consequences. Most people internalize those warnings and police themselves for life. You, however, reached a moment where you stopped asking permission. You stopped checking if your curiosity was acceptable or safe. You simply followed understanding wherever it led. What you discovered is that knowledge itself isn't inherently forbidden. It's the assumption of who is allowed to hold it that creates danger. For centuries, systems have relied on this unspoken rule. Only certain people may access certain ideas at certain times. The rest are trained to wait, defer, or ignore. By refusing to comply, you crossed a line without even needing to break anything. You didn't steal a secret. You didn't rebel openly. You just let your mind work freely, and in doing so, you stepped into a space they never expected anyone outside their circle to occupy. This is what triggers panic. Authority depends on exclusivity. When knowledge becomes accessible to someone outside the expected hierarchy, control erodes quietly but rapidly. The rules were never about keeping you safe or guiding you. They were about ensuring that no one could see the structure clearly enough to predict, manipulate, or challenge it. You weren't reckless, but your independence made the structure tremble. By rejecting permission as a requirement for understanding, you demonstrated a subtle but powerful truth. Systems only exist as long as people believe they must be granted access to participate. When you ignored the gatekeepers and let logic and insight lead, you revealed the illusion of control. That awareness didn't just change the way you think. It changed how the world responds to you. You became someone who sees what's hidden, and that is both unsettling to those invested in secrecy and liberating for anyone willing to follow the same path. Number 8. You learned to measure truth by predictability, not popularity. Most people judge ideas by how widely they are accepted. If everyone agrees, it must be true, right? You discovered that this is exactly how the system keeps control. Popularity is an emotional measure, not a functional one. It can be manipulated with repetition, persuasion, or fear. It's not evidence, it's consensus masquerading as proof. You stopped being impressed by applause and started paying attention to results. You began measuring truth by predictability. Does this principle consistently produce the same outcome under the same conditions, or does it collapse when tested? That shift changes everything. Suddenly, conventional wisdom becomes suspect, because what's widely accepted often fails in practice. You saw that the most celebrated ideas are rarely the most effective, and the most reliable principles are often invisible, unnoticed, or dismissed. You stopped following narratives and started following patterns. You didn't care who said it or how convincing the argument was. You cared only about whether it held up when applied. This approach unsettles people who build influence through popularity because it exposes their methods. Authority and social validation lose their weight when outcomes are the only currency that matters. People begin to realize how fragile their control structures are when someone refuses to measure ideas by consensus and instead measures by cause and effect. That's forbidden logic in action. It doesn't rebel, it demonstrates. It doesn't argue, it predicts. By prioritizing predictability over popularity, you became a silent disruptor. You began seeing which systems would function, which would fail, and which were maintained only by appearances. This ability makes you almost impossible to manipulate because you no longer rely on external approval to determine what is real. You evaluate, observe, and act based on evidence. Truth, you realized, is not a crowd. It is a pattern that survives scrutiny, repetition, and testing. Popularity can make a lie comfortable, but predictability reveals it for what it is. Once you adopted that lens, you stepped into a level of clarity few ever reach, and that clarity is exactly what keeps the keepers of knowledge uneasy. Number 9. You understood that power fears clarity more than rebellion. Most people think authority fears loud opposition or open defiance. They imagine that shouting, protesting, or breaking rules is what threatens control. But you discovered a quieter, far more unsettling truth. Clarity is far more dangerous than rebellion. Loud rebellion is predictable. It can be contained, punished, or negotiated. Clarity, however, cannot be intimidated or bargained with. When someone understands how a system actually works, when someone sees through manipulation and patterns instead of words, the foundation itself feels unstable. You noticed it in subtle ways. People who seemed confident became defensive when confronted with facts that were too obvious, explanations that were too coherent, or patterns that were undeniable. They didn't attack with anger. They panicked silently, misstepped, or overcompensated. Systems survive on confusion, on noise, on people second-guessing themselves. Clarity exposes the scaffolding, the invisible levers, the rules behind the rules. It removes the illusion that the game is fair, or that the authority is infallible. What you began to understand is that clarity doesn't just reveal mistakes, it predicts consequences. Someone who sees clearly doesn't need to challenge authority overtly. They operate with precision, navigating systems, anticipating moves, and avoiding traps that others stumble into blindly. Their presence alone changes the dynamics because those who relied on ignorance can no longer assume control. That's why the keepers of knowledge panic quietly when they encounter it. They know rebellion can be managed, but clarity undermines structure in a way that can't easily be repaired. You didn't need to raise your voice or break rules. You simply saw and applied understanding in ways others were trained not to. That insight makes you untouchable within a framework built on misdirection. Clarity is methodical, invisible, and lethal to pretense. It's not dramatic, but it's effective. By grasping the mechanics behind appearances and behaving accordingly, you exposed the gap between perception and reality, and in doing so, you became a presence authority can neither fully control nor ignore. Power doesn't fear defiance. It fears being seen through. That's why your logic became forbidden. Number 10. You realized most people defend systems that quietly harm them. Most people assume loyalty is a virtue, that supporting institutions, traditions, or authorities is proof of wisdom or character. You noticed something different. You started observing how often people fought tooth and nail for systems that actively worked against their interests. They defended policies, ideas, and hierarchies that drained their time, energy, and freedom, all while believing they were acting rationally or morally. The realization hits quietly but shakes everything. Systems survive not because they are good, but because people are trained to defend them, even to their own detriment. You saw patterns everywhere: family dynamics, workplaces, governments, social hierarchies. They all have mechanisms that quietly exploit the compliance of those who participate. The exploitation isn't always violent or overt. Most of the time, it's subtle. Rules that reward obedience over insight, praise that masks manipulation, protocols that prioritize appearances over outcomes. And the people inside these systems rarely notice until the harm is undeniable. What made your perspective forbidden was that you saw the harm clearly and stopped defending it. You weren't breaking rules out loud. You just refuse to follow the scripts that hurt you. That realization changes how you move through the world. Loyalty becomes conditional, not automatic. Respect isn't given based on position, but earned through alignment with reality. And you start noticing how influence operates. Those in control rely on people to act against their own interest without realizing it. By pointing out these invisible chains, even silently, you become unpredictable to the system. That's why the keepers of knowledge feel threatened. Not because you oppose them with noise, but because your perception bypasses manipulation entirely. You didn't need to fight or shout. You simply refused to be complicit. Observing harm without defending it gave you freedom few ever taste. You became someone who sees patterns, understands intent, and moves strategically through a world built on obedience. And in recognizing that most loyalty is misplaced, you stepped outside the rules they assumed everyone would follow, exposing truths that were meant to remain invisible. That awareness alone changes everything. Number 11. You stopped mistaking information for wisdom. Most people confuse the amount of knowledge they accumulate with the depth of their understanding. They collect facts, statistics, and quotes as if quantity equals insight, and they pride themselves on memorizing ideas rather than applying them. You noticed this early. You realized that knowledge without context, without synthesis, and without practical application is just noise. Wisdom, on the other hand, is rare because it requires more than memory. It requires discernment, judgment, and the ability to see the underlying principles that make information meaningful. Once you made this distinction, everything changed. You stopped chasing every headline, every trending theory, every expert opinion meant to impress. Instead, you began looking for patterns, for cause and effect, for what actually works in the real world. You tested ideas, compared results, and evaluated not by how many people agreed, but by whether the knowledge produced consistent, reliable outcomes. That shift gave you power few recognize, because most of the world remains trapped in accumulation rather than comprehension. What makes this perspective forbidden is that wisdom is not easily controlled. Facts can be regulated, books can be banned, speeches can be censored, but understanding that comes from observation, testing, and synthesis cannot be contained. By focusing on outcomes over appearances, you bypassed the traditional gatekeepers who rely on people mistaking information for insight. You saw that knowledge is only dangerous when wielded wisely, and wisdom doesn't require anyone's permission. You also noticed a quiet irony. People who appear knowledgeable often resist simplicity and clarity because it threatens their image. They mistake verbosity for sophistication, complexity for intelligence. You didn't fall for it. You learned to extract the core principle from noise, to act decisively on what mattered, and to ignore what didn't. By separating knowledge from wisdom, you stepped into a realm few ever reach. You became someone who not only understands the world, but navigates it effectively. You weren't simply informed, you were prepared, and that preparation, rooted in clarity and application, made your understanding forbidden in a world that thrives on confusion disguised as expertise. Number 12. You noticed that authority collapses when questioned calmly. Most people believe that power is maintained through force, intimidation, or loud protest. They think authority survives only when confronted directly or aggressively. What you discovered is far more subtle and far more dangerous. Calm, precise observation has a way of undermining control that noise never can. It's not about defiance, it's about perception. When you started questioning the system with clarity instead of emotion, you began to expose cracks that no one else could see. Authority isn't threatened by shouting. It thrives on chaos and spectacle, but it cannot withstand unshakable, rational scrutiny. You noticed how quickly people with power shifted under calm pressure, Arguments fell apart, evasions became obvious, and the confidence that once seemed impenetrable started to falter. The power of calm questioning lies in its invisibility. You don't scream, you don't accuse, you don't react. You simply observe, point out inconsistencies, and allow clarity to do the work. The system reacts, not because it fears defiance, but because clarity removes the safety net of deception it relies on. This is why forbidden logic frightens the keepers of knowledge. They are trained to contain, redirect, and intimidate loud opposition. Calm observation, however, bypasses all of that. It doesn't demand a response, it doesn't play by their rules, and it reveals weaknesses without confrontation. It is strategic, invisible, and quietly devastating. By refusing to be manipulated by intimidation, you create a situation where authority is exposed for what it truly is, a performance resting on belief rather than substance. You didn't need to attack, and you didn't need to rebel. You simply held space for observation and truth. Every calm, rational challenge forced the system to defend itself not publicly, but internally, and that internal struggle is where real instability begins. Authority collapses not from loud enemies, but from quiet clarity. You became a presence that couldn't be dismissed, a mind that couldn't be deceived, and that presence alone unsettles structures built on control. In doing so, you proved something few ever experience. Power is fragile when confronted by a calm, unwavering understanding of reality. Number 13. You realized survival itself rewired your perception. Most people assume that the way they see the world is natural, that perception is universal, and that understanding comes from studying or being taught. What you discovered is far different. Survival doesn't just test knowledge, it reshapes it. When life forces you into situations where failure has immediate personal consequences, your mind begins to notice patterns, anticipate outcomes, and understand systems in ways that comfort and safety never allow. You didn't learn forbidden logic from a book, a lecture, or a mentor. You earned it in the pressure of experience, and that kind of understanding is impossible to ignore or unteach. Survival rewires perception because it forces honesty. When the stakes are high, illusions dissolve quickly. You notice who acts predictably, who manipulates subtly, and which systems serve themselves rather than the people within them. You begin to see leverage points, invisible rules, and the consequences that everyone else misses because they haven't been tested by reality. Pain, struggle, and risk sharpen discernment. They teach you to recognize strategy behind deception, clarity behind noise, and cause behind the chaos that most people accept as life. What makes this understanding forbidden is that it is inherently independent. It cannot be granted, bought, or inherited. Authority fears it because it cannot be controlled. People who rely on compliance, obedience, or ignorance become irrelevant when someone has perception shaped by survival. You don't need permission to see how the world works. Your understanding comes from direct experience, which carries a weight no instruction manual can provide. This perspective also changes how you interact with others. You no longer accept superficial explanations or hollow reassurances. You measure outcomes, observe consequences, and act based on reality rather than appearances. That quiet, disciplined awareness is disarming to those who expect compliance, and it allows you to operate with precision in spaces where others flounder. Survival didn't just teach you lessons, it rewired the way your mind interprets reality. You see patterns that escape ordinary attention, act with insight that others can't anticipate, and navigate systems that many consider unbreakable. That is the source of forbidden logic, understanding earned in fire, sharpened by experience, and impossible to contain. Number 14. You understood that knowledge isn't dangerous. Timing is. Most people assume that truth is dangerous simply because of its content, that certain ideas are forbidden because they threaten the world. You discovered something much more subtle and far more powerful. Knowledge itself isn't dangerous. It's the moment when understanding arrives before the system is ready that creates real upheaval. Timing is the invisible key. When the right information emerges too early, when clarity reaches someone unprepared or positioned differently, it exposes vulnerabilities, destabilizes assumptions, and forces reactions that would never occur under controlled conditions. That's why keepers of knowledge panic, not because you know, but because you knew at the wrong time. You saw how this works everywhere. Institutions, governments, corporations, even social hierarchies all rely on the sequencing of information. Knowledge is strategically delayed, filtered, or diluted so that people remain manageable. When insight arrives too soon, patterns that were meant to remain invisible become obvious. People start acting unpredictably. Systems that seem permanent suddenly wobble under scrutiny. By accessing understanding earlier than expected, you broke the rhythm designed to contain perception. That's not rebellion, it's inevitability. What makes this perspective forbidden is that timing cannot be controlled by authority. You didn't steal, argue, or protest. You simply allowed comprehension to emerge when it naturally should have, without waiting for permission. That alone disrupts control. It shows that mastery isn't in restriction, but in sequence, and when someone disregards the imposed schedule, the illusion of order crumbles quietly but decisively. This understanding also changes how you approach action. You recognize that insight must be applied strategically, that the consequences of knowledge depend on readiness, positioning, and observation. Awareness without timing can be wasted, just as delayed understanding may arrive when influence is diminished. Mastery is not simply knowing, it's knowing when to act. By understanding that knowledge itself isn't forbidden, but timing is, you stepped into a level of perception few ever reach. You saw not just truth, but the rhythm of reality, the cadence of control, and the invisible threads that keep systems obedient. That awareness is what makes your insight forbidden, because it cannot be scheduled, predicted, or contained. The journey of understanding forbidden logic isn't about breaking rules or defying authority. It's about seeing the world differently, with clarity that others are trained never to reach. Each insight we've explored reveals a hidden layer of reality, a truth few ever notice. That obedience, complexity, morality, and authority are tools designed to control perception, not to guide understanding. You learned to separate outcomes from appearances, wisdom from information, and timing from truth. You discovered that the real power lies not in loud rebellion, but in calm observation, strategic comprehension, and the courage to follow insight where it leads. You saw patterns others overlook, connected ideas meant to remain isolated, and applied logic without asking permission. You recognized that systems depend on confusion, fear, and obedience, and you refused to participate in illusions that manipulate perception. You learned that loyalty is often misplaced, morality is frequently a leash, and that predictability is a far more reliable measure of truth than popularity. Through experience, survival, and careful observation, you began to understand how power truly operates, and more importantly, how it can be navigated with precision. This is the essence of forbidden logic. It is not flashy or attention-seeking. It doesn't rely on dramatic gestures or rebellion. It operates quietly, efficiently, and relentlessly accurate. Those who hold control become uncomfortable not because it's loud or aggressive, but because it reveals the fragility of the structures they've built and the illusions they've maintained. When clarity, understanding, and timing converge in a single mind, systems tremble, not from noise, but from comprehension. You became that mind. You became someone impossible to ignore, impossible to manipulate, and impossible to contain. If you resonate with these truths, if this insight has shifted your understanding even slightly, take action now. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected to more revelations that challenge what you thought you knew. Like this video to show you value the depth of understanding over surface-level noise. Comment below to share your thoughts, experiences, or insights. You never know who might read them and awaken their own perception. And share this video with someone ready to see the world differently, someone ready to step into clarity. Knowledge is most powerful when it spreads, and your awareness could be the spark that awakens another mind. Stay observant, stay curious, and continue walking the path that few dare to take. Merry Christmas, and God bless you.